Hello, welcome to Post Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and in this video, I will talk about 5 important things to keep in mind as a literature or humanities teacher or professor. Now, quite a few people had requested me about some strategies for teaching, but I'm not just going to list 5 things to do. I think it's better if I give you a brief philosophical discussion of these 5 things. And these 5 things include, number 1, understanding the identity needs of students, and I'll explain it in a minute. Then, knowing the difference between the entity theory of learning and identity in flux theory of learning, and I'll explain that in a minute. Then knowing the difference between the coverage model of teaching and the learning model of teaching, which is connected to number 4, knowing the difference from Freire between the banking system of education and the problem-solving system of education. And 5, one of the most significant parts of these 5 points is what is the aim of your teaching practices. What is your own teaching philosophy? Because that will have an impact on all the 4. So let's start with number 1, the identity needs of students. So first and foremost is to understand the students' identity needs. Now this comes to me, and I'm passing it on to you, from Mark Bracker's work on radical pedagogy. And he, through his reading of quite a few empirical researches into the study of consciousness, suggests that the biggest human need that we have is the need to protect our identities. Right? Keep that in mind. Anytime we enter a new space, we feel anxious because our identity is under threat. And so we spend all our energies on protecting our identities. Now, if you take this knowledge, and I have more detailed lectures on it available which you can watch, but if you just keep this in mind, that your students are spending a lot of energy sitting in the class trying to safeguard their identity, so that tells us that their identity needs are the most important factor in their learning. And if we are going to offer them some new knowledges or some new understanding of the world, then we have to keep in mind to offer it in a way that doesn't necessarily immediately challenge their identities. Because if it does that, then they would, as a response, immediately shut you off, right? And their energies will be spent on protecting their own idea of who they are. And if they are doing that, they can become disruptive, they can do self-harm, and in so many cases, it can also lead to violence, right? So knowing that the social identity needs of our students are constantly at play within a classroom setting, we can make sure that we don't believe in these mythologies that our job is to break them apart and restructure their identities. That absolutely cannot be done. It is the most destructive thing that you can do, and it can be one of the most destructive forms of pedagogy. Acknowledging in your mind that your students are anxious, not just about their grades, but also deep down psychologically, they're spending a lot of energy on protecting their idea of who they are, then you can deliver the kind of pedagogy that enhances their idea of self, right? Instead of doing things that constricts their identity and makes them defensive. So that's the first major thing to learn, knowing the identity needs of our student and the role of their idea of self being central to their learning. Now we'll move to the next one, and that is understanding that our students also inhabit different identities as learners, right? So there are those who can be considered as possessors of entity theory, of identity or identity in flux. Now, this comes from a book by John Tagg, which is called The Learning Paradigm College. But how is it significant in a teaching environment? So, if your students turn in their papers and you write copious comments on them, and you usually see two different kinds of responses from the students. There'll be a student who will come to you and say, "Thank you so much for taking the time to comment on my paper. I will go and revise it." And there'll be another student who could come to you and say, "This is, you've just totally destroyed my argument. You've discouraged me. I don't feel the need to revise it." Or even if they don't say it, that's how they feel. Now, the reason there are these two responses is because the first student is performing the identity in flux model. These are those people who think that they can constantly improve themselves. And that is the purpose of education. And so if you have students who believe in that, they will ask you for more feedback. And when you give them more feedback, since they are not seeing their work as an intended final outcome of who they are, they're seeing it as a work in progress. And since they've already internalized that their selves will also constantly keep growing, they see any criticism of their work as a positive thing. But if a student inhabits an entity theory of self, then that means that they think they are complete, fully realized human beings. And hence the work that they produce is an extension of themselves. It is as perfect as they are. So then when you're criticizing their work, they get emotional, defensive, because it's not just the work. By criticizing their work, you are criticizing them, because the work is an extension of them. Now, how does that help? Well, if you know these subtle differences, I do recommend John Tagg's book, and the references to all the books will be in the description. Then you can at least understand the response of your students. The idea is to become better teachers, right? That's why I'm recording this. That's why you're listening to it. So that's the second point. The first point, knowing their social identity needs, that the identity is the prime mover of your students, but pretty much everyone else's actions in the world. And two, that some students will inhabit an entity theory of self, which believes that they are complete in themselves, and some other students will inhabit an idea of identity in flux, right? And seeking constant improvement, and their needs will thus be different from each other. Now, coming to the coverage versus learning model, it's pretty simple. All of us who teach in colleges or schools have timetables. We're given dates by which something must be covered, and then we move on. So the coverage model of teaching is where you are bound by a syllabus, either yourself or officially, where you must do something by a certain date, right? And it is the most destructive mode of teaching, because all you're trying to do is to cover the syllabus. What you're not worried about is whether you've given enough time for someone to learn a thing before moving on to the other topic. The learning model believes that these temporalities, the time frames, are artificial because learning never ends. It's not like a course ended and you've learned everything. So what it enables then is the teacher the facility and the freedom to say, hey guys, we had assigned 2 class sessions for this topic for discussing Joseph Conrad, but I don't think so 2 class sessions have done justice to it. You already still have a lot of questions. Let's spend another week on it. That is the learning paradigm, the learning model, because what you're focusing on is, let's understand as best as we can this novel instead of just saying the time is up, let's move to the next one. And that way, the learning would be deeper. The coverage model basically takes pride in, oh, we read 7 novels, right? But doesn't necessarily focus on how deeply did we read them. Now, I know we all work within institutional constraints, but wherever possible, right, try to undo the coverage model by the learning model, wherever you can accommodate it. And trust me, when you let your students decide the time frame or allow them the chance to ask more questions, their learning will be deeper and your experience of teaching would be highly, highly positive. I mean, I've seen that happen in my classes. And related to these two is our number 4, banking system versus problem posing solutions education, right? I have a whole series on Freire which I highly recommend, but basically the banking system is when we as teachers think we have all the knowledge and we are the agents in our class and the students are these passive recipients and we must pour our knowledge into them. The students have no say in their learning. That is also a very destructive mode of teaching, and sadly it is still used in most of the post-colonial nation states because we inherited that system from our colonizers. So instead, we should either create a hybrid where we do deliver some content, but then expect our students to learn it, ask questions, right? And that would be a move into the problem posing or problem solving education, an education that encourages students to contribute in their own education, come up with ideas or modes of delivering things, right? And then gives them knowledge where they can go and solve the problem in class or problems outside. One way that I do it is where to encourage student participation. What I would do is sometimes I tell them, hey, if you don't like this assignment, suggest another. And if the majority of the class votes on it, we will change the assignment to whatever you want. My interest is that you should understand what you are learning. My interest is not that you should reproduce it in a certain specific way. And that always works because students feel like they have a voice in our class, and they sometimes can have the right or the privilege of suggesting changes to us. Also, students telling us, Professor, the way you're explaining it doesn't make sense. Can you explain it differently? If you did it this way, maybe we'll understand it better. Remember, if they are active participants in the act of learning, then they can also teach you, right, how to teach better, how to explain things better, right? And so that's number 4. Knowing the distinction between the banking system and the problem-solving system. The deeper knowledge about it, of course, is in Paulo Freire, and you can watch my series on this. And the 5th, and probably the most important point, is your own teaching philosophy, because it will have a bearing on all the other 4 things that I talked about. Now, what do you think education is or ought to be? If you think that education is simply giving students certain empirical materials, certain concepts, certain skills, right? Then that will define your entire teaching model. You'll be focused on they need to learn this, they need to learn to form sentences, they need to learn that, right? And with that will come its limitations, right? Because then you are not necessarily doing something dynamic or dialogic, you're just delivering content, right? Now, if your teaching philosophy is that education ought to enable students to think for themselves, to think critically, right? Then maybe you'll deliver some content, you will give them some prepared lectures, but also you will encourage them to solve problems on their own, to think critically about a text, to think critically about a poem, right? So you have now expanded your own horizon as a teacher, but also the learning experience for your students. Now, in another case, maybe your teaching, your pedagogy is also connected to giving an understanding of the text and the content, encouraging students to think about critically, ask questions, try to solve it, try to answer questions. And 3, connecting it to the real world issues, like you're teaching sun also rises, you're teaching, God of small things. You can either teach it as the history of, this language and Kerala and all, and this is what happens in the novel on the level of the content. You can teach it historically. This is the part of India where it came from. What do you think about it? That means their input is in it. And 3, Your philosophy can also incorporate, okay, we've read this novel, it's from this part of India, these are the issues that it deals with. Now, can you point to any similar issues in the world as it exists, or where you live? And if there are those issues, what do you think we can do collectively to address those issues? So then what you have done is you have given understanding of a text, textual understanding of it, historical understanding of it. You have encouraged your students to think critically about it, about the text itself and its context. And then you have taught them, or you have discussed with them, the possibility that whatever we learn in this class has some practical value in thinking the world differently, maybe more compassionately, right? Depending on where you are on this spectrum, right, will then, because your philosophy matters, because it impacts your praxis, right, your practice too. So that will then define all the other 4 areas for you. So that's all I had to share, mostly from my readings, but also somewhat from my own experience as a teacher. Right. So first and foremost, let me just conclude by repeating these things. Knowing students' identity needs and knowing that protecting their identity is their first unconscious thing on their minds, right? Then knowing that some students inhabit the entity theory, some believe in identity in flux and how to modulate their responses to your criticism or even your constructive criticism. Then knowing the difference between the coverage model, this week this week that, against the learning model. Similarly related, knowing the difference between the banking system in which teacher is the agent and students are considered passive, and the problem-posing educational system which encourages students to think independently or collectively to solve problems or learn to solve problems. And then all of this connected to who you are as a teacher, what is your teaching philosophy, and how do you practice it. That's all I have today on this topic. I hope this was useful. If you have any questions, please post them in the comments. Let me know if there is anything else that I missed that you would like me to cover. I'm deeply grateful for your time. Thank you so much, and I will now see you next time. Until then, as always, from me, peace and love.